Hey, welcome back everybody to our weekly text study here at St. Mark Presbyterian Church. I'm Mark Davis and I'm very happy to be part of these studies with you. But as you will see from our schedule, today and this week is the last study that we have. So this Wednesday will be the last time we gather until after the beginning of 2025. And I have to tell you, I don't know of a better text with which we can end than this one. It's a story that I think I just sort of appreciated for many, many years. And thanks to the writings of Ched Myers, I was more attentive to the depth of this story, and particularly the criticality of this story in Mark's overall storytelling. And now I'm finding that every time I read it, every time I study it, every time I read about it, I'm discovering more and more levels of profundity, levels of meaning, and just really convincing me that Mark is both a brilliant writer and that this story shows us something about Jesus that's just really incredible. So without any more ado, just a reminder, this will be our last class for the year 2024, and I should say, as long as I have you, I really appreciate not only the folks who show up in the room when we have discussions, or the folks who show up on the Zoom when we have discussions, but those of you who have been watching the videos yourself and have just perhaps later circled back to watch the discussions. I don't know who all of you are, but I appreciate occasionally when I hear from some of you that you've been watching. It's a great honor and an energizing part of my work and ministry to study Scripture with you. So thank you so much for being part of that. So let's read. Our last story is the end of the 10th chapter in Mark's Gospel, verses 46 through 52. They came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet. But he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. All right, that ends the reading. And what I'd like to do is begin by looking at the context in which this story is set. It's a significant context. And the valuable thing about being part of this study is that you've been reading this context with us together for the last few weeks. We could go back many chapters to look at the larger scope of the context. I want to be a little more narrowly focused and particularly go back to verse 17 of chapter 10. And that's where we have the story of the rich man who comes to Jesus asking, how can I be saved? What must I do to inherit eternal life? Think about that story. Remember how desperately that man came and threw himself at Jesus' feet? He had all of the looks of desperation as Jairus had when he came begging for the life of his daughter. So that rich man runs in and is desperate for Jesus, and in many ways that's something that we see with Bartimaeus. We'll look more closely at some of the language there, but he is crying out for attention as well. So that's part of the context here, and we'll circle back to that story and compare it to the Bartimaeus story in just a moment. And then, after that, after the rich man story, Jesus, for the third time, discloses that he's going to die and be raised again. And remember the pattern. For the third time, one or more of the disciples respond badly. And in this case, it's James and John asking, if they could have the primo seats in the reign of Christ when he comes. And for the third time, that inappropriate response is met with a teaching about discipleship, including a paradox. The greatest, who you want to be the greatest must become the least, you want to be the master must become the servant, and even ending in verse 45, that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. So Jesus himself is the paradox there. So all of that is leading up to our story of Bartimaeus. And I think there are a lot of inherent connections in the Bartimaeus story with those two stories that preceded it, as well as the one that follows. So the Bartimaeus story takes us to the end of chapter 10. In the beginning of chapter 11, as many of you well know, is the story that we read on Palm Sunday. At least about every third year, we'll read Mark's version of it. In Mark chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. And there's a lot about that story that's similar to the Bartimaeus story as well. So one thing I'm going to ask you to do throughout your reading of the Bartimaeus story is to reflect back and look forward in other parts of Mark's gospel to see some of the connections. Some of them will be similarities. Some of them will be differences. Do some comparison there and see what it tells you about this fascinating person named Bartimaeus. So let's turn our attention to that story in particular now and look at the outline of the story. We begin with the setting, and it's curious, isn't it? Back in verse 46, it says they entered into Jericho, and then as they were leaving Jericho. So you have them coming in and going out. We don't really, doesn't say why they went to Jericho. One thing you might ask yourself is, the one story that you know about Jericho from the Old Testament, is that being echoed here? It's the story of Joshua, and you remember how they came to Jericho, and the way that they defeated Jericho, which at that time was a pagan city, is by marching around 7 times and shouting. They didn't even lift up their arms, right? They didn't take war. They used God's power and got that by shouting and marching around Jericho. Is that being echoed in this story? Or, maybe Mark didn't know the story, the song Joshua fit the battle around Jericho, and perhaps wasn't as enamored with that story as we are. I don't know. It just says they came into Jericho and then they entered Jericho. Nothing happened. But what I want you to remember is that after Jesus enters into Jerusalem in the 11th chapter, it says that they went into the temple, and he looked around, and seeing how it was late in the evening, they went home. So we have another instance of Jesus going into a place, doing nothing, and leaving. It's a really interesting kind of uneventful, anticlimactic ending to the entry into Jerusalem. What can Mark possibly be conveying to us? What can the Gospel of Mark be conveying to us with these two different instances where they go into a place, nothing particular happens? In one, they look around, and then they leave. Is there something about that speaks to us? I don't know. I just see it as a little bit of a pattern, and it mystifies me. I don't, that's the part of the story I don't quite understand, but that's the setting, is that they enter Jericho, and now they're leaving Jericho, and it's on the outskirts of Jericho that the story of Bartimaeus happens. Bartimaeus is introduced to us as Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. That's an interesting thing. It may indicate to us once more that Mark's audience, Mark's readers, the folks for whom he was originally writing this gospel, not those of us who have inherited it millennia later, but his original readers may not have known much about life in Judea or life in Galilee or the Jewish way of life. If you know anything about the Jewish way of life, you know that the word bar, or the prefix bar, means son. The word bar means son. The prefix bar attached to a name means son of. So Bar Joseph means son of Joseph. It wouldn't be unusual if some people referred to Jesus as Jesus Bar Joseph, given that there were other people named Jesus around. We see a character named Barabbas. That's a peculiar name, possibly, perhaps not even a real name, because translated it means son of a father. Could basically apply to any grown-up male. But here we have Bartimaeus, and Mark tells his readers that means son of Timaeus. And that's the reason why we think perhaps Mark is not writing to Jews, or not writing to people familiar with the Jewish habits of naming and speaking. And the word Timaeus, now it's kind of hard to translate that. There are two possibilities that have been suggested. It could mean something like honor, or it could be something like shame. Now, I realize those are opposites. And nonetheless, I'm going to tell you, those are two possibilities of how you might hear the name Timaeus. So Bartimaeus could be son of honor, son of shame, son of fame, son of shame, as Gareth Hughes puts it. Two real differences there. And that word Timaeus, we're going to circle back to that in a minute, because there's another form of it that also has two possible meanings. The last story we heard of Jesus healing a blind man was back in the 8th chapter, just before that first disclosure about Jesus' death. And some people feel like that story, that healing of the blind man in chapter 8, verses 22 through 26, maybe marks the end of the first major section of Mark's gospel. The second major section of Mark's gospel would begin when Jesus begins to query the disciples on the road, who are people saying that I am? And the second would then end with another healing of a blind man. So it could be that in the writing of this gospel, Mark is using these healing stories as kind of parameters, as it were, over the different sections of the gospel. I don't know. That may be true, may not be. So you have Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, which we already knew from his name, but perhaps the assumption is we don't know Hebrew ways of speaking. That could be son of honor, could be son of shame, depending on how you hear it or interpret it. And then we have the interaction between Bartimaeus and the crowd. This is really kind of interesting, and there are 3 different words that are going to be used for the crowd. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to those. They may indicate the same folks, just stated differently. They might indicate a smaller group within a larger group or something like that. I don't know. I'll just tell you what those terms are. Initially, in the setting, as they go into Jericho and come out of Jericho, Mark says that it's Jesus and the disciples and a crowd, or the crowd. So that's the first that we hear of the crowd. And the Greek word there is oklos, which is almost always translated crowd. It happens a lot in Mark's gospel. And then the second time we hear from the folks, the people there, Bartimaeus cries out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And in some translations, it's a little sloppy at this point, in some translations it would say the crowd rebuked him and ordered him to be silent. It's a different word. It's the word poloi, which you may know from the phrase hoi polloi, which means the many, sometimes translated the crowd, but it's a different word than the one used originally. So Bartimaeus cries out for Jesus to have mercy, and many in the crowd tell him to be quiet. Want to hold some of the terms there so you'll know some of the dynamics of what's going on here. When it says that Bartimaeus cried out, that word is one that we've seen before, and I pointed out before. It's the Greek word kraxo, and we think it's an onomatopoeia. In other words, a word that instantiates itself with its sound, kind of like, and it's supposed to sound like the sound of a crow or a raven, a squawking of a sort. Kraxo, something like that. I think an English equivalent would be the word squawk. And that's how I tend to translate it, squawk. Because the word itself is the sound that squawking is. I'm not going to make that sound because I don't like doing that. But there you go. Bartimaeus is squawking, an irritating sound, as it were, squawking, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the crowd rebukes him. It's that word rebuke that we've seen before. Remember the first time Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to die and be raised again? Simon Peter rebuked him. Remember how when Simon Peter rebuked him, Jesus rebuked him right back? Remember how when Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" And they started answering, and then Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter said, "You're the Christ, the Messiah." Jesus rebuked them and told them not to say anything to anybody. It's the same word that's being used in that story that's being used in this story. And sometimes our translations say rebuke, and sometimes they say sternly ordered, something like that. I don't know why they choose a different language for translating that same word, but it's the word that we hear as rebuke. The crowd rebuked him to be silent. I want you to hang on to this for a minute. Be silent. That phrase is not the verb to be followed by an adjective that means silent. It's a single word and it's a verb. So it's almost like, silencing. It's a verb. It's a verb. And I want you to hear it as such. It's the same word that Jesus says when the storm is raging and he says, "Peace, be still." Be still. So it's like in the passive, but be still. That's what the crowd is doing to Bartimaeus. So look, not only is this guy blind, now they're trying to make him mute. Right? Not only can he not see, now they don't want him to talk either. Remember how the disciples tried to ward off children as people were bringing them to Jesus? Now the crowd's trying to ward off this annoyingly loud, squawky, blind beggar on the side of the road. So Bartimaeus squawks, the crowd rebukes, and orders him to be silent. In response, Bartimaeus squawks even louder, which shows he's got some gumption, that guy. And but then something else happens, and that's when Jesus seems to start paying attention to Bartimaeus. Unlike the crowd earlier, Jesus says to them. That's the third indication of some or all of the crowd. We don't know exactly to whom Jesus was talking. It's just a third person plural pronoun. Jesus says to them, call him. And they, that third person plural pronoun, they change their tune quite a bit, and they say to Bartimaeus, get up, be of good cheer, be encouraged, take courage. He is calling you. So, the crowd first rebukes, and then they try to shut down Bartimaeus, and then after Jesus speaks, the crowd calls and encourages Bartimaeus. And I'm saying the crowd, it's they, whoever they are. They go, the many go from rebuking, and now they are calling. It's really an interesting morphing of the collective response around this story. When Jesus, and we don't know why, Jesus didn't just stop and walk over there and start talking to Bartimaeus himself. But in the story, Jesus gets the crowd involved, or they involved. And I think this is a really interesting potential way of thinking about evangelism and how Christ empowers us to tell people, be of good courage, he is calling for you. They're not going to fix Bartimaeus. It's not their job to heal the blind. It's their job to convey the call of Jesus to this man. It's a really interesting, striking thing that happens to this crowd, the many and they here, as they interact with Bartimaeus. And then, of course, there's the interaction between Jesus and Bartimaeus. Now the name comes into focus. The son of Timaeus is calling out to Jesus, son of David. We got a son-to-son communication going on here. And we're going to find in the next story, as Jesus enters Jerusalem, he's being considered a son of David there. It's not as explicit in Mark's gospel as it will be in Matthew and Luke. But in chapter 12, Mark chapter 12, Jesus is arguing with scribes, Pharisees, chief priests, and they're laying a bunch of trick questions out to try to trip him up. And at one point, Jesus turns the tide and he asks them the question. And he asks, why is it that the scribes say that the Messiah will be the son of David, when David referred to the Messiah as his Lord? Now that's a question that's lost on many of us because we don't have quite the first century Middle Eastern presumption that the ancestor is much more honored than the descendant. And for David to refer to as the Messiah as his Lord would mean that David is not the Messiah's ancestor. It feels like in chapter 12, Jesus is actually saying this title of Son of David is not an appropriate title for him. And he continues to prefer Son of Man. Son of David had been associated a lot with a militaristic monarchy figure, and that's not the kind of Christ that Jesus is choosing to be. So you've got the son of Timaeus, properly named, I suppose, talking to the son of David, improperly named, and then Jesus asks Bartimaeus, "What is it you want me to do for you?" You should recognize that question. James and John came to Jesus in the last story, said, "We want you to do for us whatever we ask." And Jesus looked at them and said, "What is it you want me to do for you?" The same question he asked James and John. Their request was made in ignorance and inappropriate, and it wasn't for Jesus to answer. Bartimaeus' question is made out of desperation. He wants to see. And Jesus then says to Bartimaeus, your faith has made you well. Go. Jesus tells him to go. And Bartimaeus disobeys. Let's talk on Wednesday about Bartimaeus disobeying. I think that's fascinating that he's told to go, and instead he follows Jesus on the way. All right, so that's our story. We've kind of walked through all the different interactions, and they're very complex and filled, I think, with either echoes or anticipations of other things happening in Mark's story. So let's look at a couple potential compare and contrast texts that I would invite you to circle back and look at before Wednesday, and then I'm going to ask you to even come up with your own. Compare the story of Bartimaeus, whose name is so long I just started writing him down as Bart. Compare the story of Bartimaeus and the story of Peter, the one who called Jesus Son of David and does not get corrected in this story, the one who called Jesus Messiah and was told immediately to say nothing to anybody, was rebuked, as a matter of fact, by Jesus. Go back and look at that story and see what similarities and differences you might see there. One other title that Bartimaeus uses is when Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? He says, teacher, that I may see again. So Bartimaeus was not born blind, but he calls him teacher, and in the Greek text, it's the word Rabboni, from which we get rabbi. And this is one of only 2 times that term is used in the New Testament. The other is in the Gospel of John, when Mary encounters Jesus, the risen Christ, after the resurrection, and calls him Rabboni. It's really interesting that it's a very select use of that term. So look at how Peter names Jesus, and then look at how Bartimaeus names Jesus, and see how their stories might be similar or different. Look at the story. This one I think is startling. Look at the story of the rich man that we read in verses 17 through 31 of the same chapter, and Bartimaeus. Compare them. I think that's a key comparison, and I will tell you about it on Wednesday, why I think that's a key comparison. But I'd like for you to give it a look at yourself and see what you think. Look at the difference and similarities between the story of Bartimaeus and the story we read last week of James and John. There are some similarities there. There are some differences there. Ask yourself what that means. And then I really do invite you to think in terms of what other stories there might be out there that are both similar and different. You could look at the story of the triumphal entry. You could look at the story of Jesus on trial and see how Jesus is addressed. And you could look at the other story of the person who was healed of blindness. You could look at other healing stories. Think about that phrase, your faith has made you well. Think about where you've seen that before. Look it up. Get your little study Bible out. See if you can find the cross-reference there. I think this story interacts really, really well with a whole bunch of other stories and ends up being just a fascinating story in its own right. So that's it for now. I will see you Wednesday at 10 o'clock for the last time here in our Bonhoeffer room. If you can join us on the Zoom, if that works better, or you can see us having that conversation if you're unable to be available Wednesday at 10. Thank you again so much for tuning in throughout this series. It's been fascinating, and I look forward to the time when we can do it again. Thanks. Bye.